And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always, Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How you doing?
Very well, Brian. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good. Yeah, it's been a feels like a very long week. I bet it feels even longer for you coming back from the other side of the world. But it's felt like a
Yes.
fairly long week, but it's good. And yeah, everything's going good.
And you had a birthday this week, so happy birthday.
Thank you. Yes, I try not to look at those too closely, but yes, as as my wife says, another year around the sun. So
Yeah.
made another
Yeah.
one. So
There you
happy
go.
about
That's
that.
good. The
Yeah,
alternative's not so good. But it's good. We're glad you're here.
I tell two things I've told clients. When they say getting old sucks, it's like it beats the alternative.
Yep, exactly.
And
Absolutely.
one of my 80-year-olds used to always say, as long as I'm on the green side of the grass, it's okay. I was like, wow, okay.
I'll go with that.
I was like, I like that. Stay on the green side of the grass. All right. Uh,
That's great.
well, today's topic, we discussed about coming back and doing some deeper dives for people who
Mhm.
are just now discovering the podcast. We wanted to do a little bit deeper dive, and we figured why not cover this topic because you and I literally just covered this topic for Level Up Movement for an online mastermind class, they call it. And it was what we go a little over an hour and a half
Yeah. Yeah.
or so.
On on the discs. Don't miss
Yeah.
the discs. So looking at lumbar disc issues and just disc issues generally, because they're not that uncommon. And we
Yep.
always get a lot of questions about them, always from clients and from teachers and from movement professionals of all kinds. So we wanted to get a deep dive into them, see if we can help you out.
Yep. And if you're interested in checking that out, go to Level Up Movement. And that's spelled differently. So you guys know the movement is MVMT. So levelupmvmt.com. And if you just look up low back, we will be there. It was a fun class. We're going to be doing a Q&A. So if you have lots of questions about the lumbar spine, we're going to be doing that in a couple of weeks. So you can register for that as well on their website if you're interested. But hopefully today we can answer a whole lot of questions that you may have and don't get an opportunity to ask us directly. But before we do that, just want to remind everybody this is Moving Conversations. You can always reach us at moving convos at gmail.com or moving convos on social media, Instagram. If you check out the description each week, it also has Nora and my personal as well as the podcast socials. So you can reach us on all of those. But the best way to do it is literally just do it through movingcombos at gmail.com and hit the like, hit the subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, hey, you can see us you can actually see us and all of our gesticulations and our hands going crazy and things. So yeah, so that's the way to check us out each week. Hit the like and subscribe, and we'd appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right,
Awesome.
let's
Awesome.
dive in. Let's dive into those
It's a deep
discs.
dive. So, what are the discs?
Yes. You want me to go first? So the disc,
So, yes.
what the disc is there for? I always tell people think of it as a shock absorber for your spine. It's
Mhm.
really there to provide. Uh, well, for one, you want to keep it nourished. We want to
Yep.
always nourish our spine, and we're going to nourish our disc through the bones. But those discs really are there to add a shock absorption between two bones, as well as provide space, this proper amount of space, so that we have our nervous tissue. Our nerves coming out through those intervertebral spaces, out the sides of the backside and sides of your spinal column. So we want to make sure we maintain that height. So we want nice, nourished, plump discs. Uh, but really, that's what the discs are there for, is to provide that cushioning.
They also provide stability because they connect
Oh,
one vertebrae
absolutely.
to the other, right? So they also provide a level of security and a level of stability for the whole spine. So it connects each
Yep.
piece, each of the basically building blocks, because the vertebrae are like this little block sticking on top of each other,
Yep.
right? It sticks them together. And it sticks them together in a very particular way. So when you think about a disc, we use the analogy of the jelly donut. Okay.
Yes,
Now, the good thing about the jelly donut is there is a jelly donut in virtually every place that I have ever been. In
that's
Asia,
true.
it's the bao, right? In Europe,
Yep.
it's the Berliner, which is basically a jelly donut. And in America, it's the jelly donut. So you have a squishy middle, the nucleus pulposus, and you have a fibrous outside, the annulus fibrosus, which is a series of fibers that are in opposition to each other at a different angle. So boom, 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 many, 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 many layers of fibers which
Yep.
hold the vertebra together and hold the disc material inside.
Yeah, and they are those fibers run at different angles to provide strength.
Mhm.
If you think about all of them running the same direction, well, it would give that nucleus pulposa more of an opportunity to slide through,
A-
rather
And sh- and,
than
there's- and and shear forces, right?
and a
Any
lot of shear
close
force.
rotation is going to like,
Yep,
yeah, potentially
absolutely.
true. Yeah.
So they're at diagonals, they're at vertical, they're all these different angles to really provide a webbing to protect. And I've read in the literature anywhere from in the lumbar spine 18 to 28 layers. Uh, I do not want to be that person that had to count each one of those layers. It's, kind of like, how old am I? Well, cut me in half and count the rings. Well, that's kind of what you were doing. Uh,
Good.
and something that I look at too is if you think about if you're looking at the discs, when you look at the cervical, those discs are much smaller. So you're going to have much fewer of those rings because you don't need it. You don't need the same amount of stretch or same amount of protection because you don't have the same amount of stress as we do the further down we go. There's a lot more weight, there's a lot more compression. And so you need to sort of build up those walls. Think of it as a series of walls protecting the castle. The more
Mm.
walls there are, it's going to help protect that a lot better. So if someone is 300 pounds versus 110 pounds, would they likely have more discs, and would the disc actually probably be a larger size on that person just because their vertebrae would be bigger?
Yeah. One of the guys that I dissected at one point, one of the people that I was in a dissection course with, was a really big guy. He was probably 6'3" or 6'4", just a big, obviously manual laborer. His lumbar vertebra were this big. The body of the vertebra was this big. So the disc has got to be that much bigger,
So
right?
like
It
the
wasn't
so like the
usually
size of a can of Coke.
basically bigger. He
Yeah,
was actually even a little
bigger.
bit bigger. And you look
Wow,
at the bones that are in most of our plastic models, they're like this big.
they're
Right? They're
small.
much, much smaller. So that was a good illustration of that fact, right? Just that there's going to be a lot more tissue because it's a much bigger disc. It's twice the size of the ones we often see in our plastic models.
And that's just it. People have a tendency because they already see the exact same plastic model based on, as I mean, you were the first one to clue me on this, Asian population. That's where a lot of these molds
Mhm.
were created, were some, we're looking at those type of bodies. So you look at a male articulated skeleton, and I'm thinking, well, this person was only 5'6", 5'7". Their pelvis is a whole. I mean, you compare
Yeah.
their pelvis to my pelvis or
Right.
my,
Bones, bones.
and I've literally taken one of their scapula and put it on top of mine, and I'm like, mine's twice as big as this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So it really is. The bigger the person is, you're going to have that. Those bones are going to naturally be bigger. So it would just make sense that the discs would be larger and that there
Mhm.
would be more of those concentric rings protecting the nucleus.
So with that in mind, I want to talk a bit about how the discs get nourished because when I
Hmm.
first was working with rehabilitation and thinking about disc injuries, in my mind, I really thought of discs as just being problematic. Like I really just thought of the pathologies of discs. I really didn't think of them so much in terms of what brings them health, what brings them longevity, what keeps them healthy. And then
Hmm.
I was working with Eric Franklin. He just like turned my little brain around very quickly and was like, well, no, no. How do you actually nourish a disc? Don't
Uh-huh.
worry about, yes, it may get damaged, but how do you keep it from that? Or how do you at least manage to keep it healthier longer? And the key thing on discs is discs are nourished by the end plates of the vertebra, by essentially fluid moving from the disc into the end plates and the end plates into the disc. And there's not a lot of fluid flow, there's not a lot of circulation, there's not a lot of nourishment there, but there is that small potential for just keeping fresh fluid, fresh material in there to nourish the disc. And that happens a lot through movement,
Hmm.
a lot through movement, and specifically through breathing.
Yep. Yep.
So if you breathe, if you breathe in and you breathe out, when you breathe in, I always imagine that that space between my vertebrae is getting wider, right? I'm breathing in. It's like I'm inflating my lungs and I'm creating a little more space. It's like I'm taking that sponge and the sponge is opened up. And then when I exhale, right, that sponge squeezes a bit, fluid goes out into the end plates. And then when I open it back up again, fluid pulls back in. So rotation, breath, movement, all keep those discs happier.
Movement is the key that I've always told people about. And I'm going to take a step back to what you said just a second ago. I think it's really important as movement professionals for us to constantly remind ourselves that our job is not just to help people heal, but also to help them live longer and help them nourish. Because let's face it, if we're talking about the spine, I don't know about you, but I've only met a few people that have had, herniated discs up and down their entire spine.
Mhm.
We may have one, and yes, there's a pathology there that we have to deal with when we're working with this client. But we still should be thinking about how do we keep the other ones happy and healthy and nourished and moving properly. And I think
Yes.
that's something that we as fitness professionals who deal with a lot of rehabilitation, we get sort of stuck in the, and I'm guilty for that of that too, that we get stuck on the pathology, pathology, pathology. Here's our limitations. Rather than saying, okay, yes, we have some limitations, but we still need to keep everything else healthy. We need to take a look at the entire unit, the entire spine, the entire body, and make sure we're giving it the health, the nourishment that it needs with movement. And when it comes to those vertebral end plates, now sometimes when they come to us, yes, they're going to have a little bit more, wear and tear. Just
I've lost your audio.
something's happening. Can
Better
you hear
now.
what's going on?
You just dropped out for a minute, and then now you're
Okay.
back.
Okay, sorry about that. My
Nope.
phone rang and suddenly everything went kind of kaput. Okay, let's okay. Pausing. Let's do this again. Putting everything on do not disturb. All right. Uh, but when we talk about those vertebral end plates, that's sort of the first time I heard about those. It really woke me up because when we think of muscles, when we think of bones, everything else, we always have a tendency to think about the arteries and the nerve supply to those areas. Okay. We think of the arteries, we think of the veins. This doesn't have that. We get all of our nourishment through those end plates on the top and bottom of the uh, adjoining vertebrae. And that's so important to think about. So just having you stand up and sit down again, you're opening that area up, you're closing it up kind of like a sponge. Think about those discs as a sponge. You're literally squeezing it out and then letting nourishment back in, squeezing it out and letting nourishment back in. So the more movement we do, I think is very, very important for us.
And one of the big risks for disc stuff is sitting. Right,
Yes.
sitting for extended periods, not moving in a slumped position where that compression just keeps and maybe not breathing much for whatever reason because you're not doing much, right? That this is going to compress the vertebra. It's going to compress the discs, not the vertebra. It's going to compress the discs and squeeze that tissue out to the ends, right? That fluid and that nourishment out and dehydrate the sponges, if you will.
Mhm.
And that's really where, again, standing up, moving around, taking a walk, going for rotating your spine a bit, even wiggling in your chair. This is where things like
Mhm.
ball chairs and stuff are helpful. Just something that keeps you from staying statically in any one position.
Yep.
Right. Because
Yep.
because you really you kind of don't want to be shorter at the end of the day than you are at the beginning of the day. Most of us do end up that way because of gravity. But for healthy discs, you kind of want to be the same height in the morning and in the evening because that means you've maintained that squishy, spongy quality of those discs. You've really worked on maintaining their nourishment.
And if you think about even something as simple as setting an alarm, I mean, I don't know if you
Yeah.
have this, but my Apple Watch, it tells me to get up and move every hour. So if I'm sitting at the desk and, I mean, if you're anything like me, you can be sitting here focused on that computer and 2 or 3 hours can go by and it's like a blink
Mhm.
of an eye and you haven't
Yeah.
moved much.
Yep.
Whereas this will actually thump me and say, "Hey, hey, hey, you, go stand up for a little bit.
Get up. Get up.
Get up and move. So that's important. Oh, okay. You get up, you walk around, you come back. At least you've got an opportunity to nourish the spine, and get your whole body moving because we really want to stay in motion. We have a
Yeah.
tendency to remain seated, to remain static. Inertia is such a son of a gun. It just sort of sucks you in. Chairs suck, just, and you don't want to move. But we need to get up. We need to move around. And it's not just for our spine, but for all of our entire body.
Right. So thinking about that, so that's a little piece on prevention, right? On maintaining disc health for the long run. And with all of your clients who sit at desks and work in environments like that, just remind them, like again, have them set a timer or make sure they get up and go to the water fountain every hour or go talk to their buddy or something. Because that's a lot of times what will really help the discs stay healthy over time.
Mhm.
Now, a disc injury can happen a bunch of different ways. Typically, it happens from uh, excessive flexion over time. So, classic examples are things like a friend of mine was refinishing their floor and was down on their knees, bending over for 3 days in a row. And this is
Yep.
a person who's pretty stiff and who really doesn't have a lot of hip or back mobility to start with. And now they're down on their hands and knees in a flexed position with force because they're using like a sander and that kind of thing. And the discs don't have the endurance or the strength to tolerate that much flexion.
Yep.
Right. So then what happens is that annulus fibrosus gets weak just because there's pressure from the nucleus pulposus pushing on it, pushing on it, pushing on it, and sort of wearing out some of those fibers until it causes potentially a disc protrusion, or there's a lot of different names for it, an annular tear, disc herniation. There's all kinds of different names, not all of which mean the same thing, depending what doctor you talk to, just to be clear on that. Right. But basically, that wall gets weak, and the nucleus pulposus can then start to push through. Instead of being a solid wall, you get a little bit of a protrusion of that disc out of the wall
Think about that
or
jelly
into the
donut.
wall.
It's basically you take a jelly donut and you put it between your hands, and in flexion, you're literally squeezing the front side over and over and over again like a
Yep.
wedge, and it's
Pushing the
pushing all
disc.
of that disc, that nucleus, pushing it behind like the jelly donut would be. And the more you do it, I mean, just think about if you kept the jelly donut that way for a long period of time, it's going to want to keep that nucleus pulposus back there, and eventually it's going to leak out. It's
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something that we don't want. We want to go and we want to be an extension. We want that nucleus to be in the center, not slid all the way to the side and staying there for a longer period of time.
Exactly. So with that in mind, it's like, so again, we worked on core strength, core stability. If you think about the key principles we need for disc material, for keeping the discs happy, there's movement, but there's also where is the best position for the spine, for your spine?
Mhm.
Finding what I often call your neutral position,
Yep.
because everybody's is a little different. There's a landmarks we sometimes use to assess that, like their ASIS, your hip pointers, and your pubic bone being on a plane, relatively the same plane, either parallel to the floor, perpendicular to the ground if you're standing up. That's kind of the two things that we use as a general guideline. But that's not everybody's best position. Sometimes people need to be a
Mhm.
little more arched in their spine, a little more anteriorly tilted in their pelvis, or a little more posterior, just to get the right balance for their particular musculature and their particular back structure.
Yeah, and you said it perfectly, their back structure. Because how many of us, if I took 10 of my clients and lined them up, and all of them don't have low back pain right now, every one of them is going to have slightly different neutral.
Yep.
Very, very few people have I worked with that have had that picture perfect neutral spine.
Yep.
Very, very few.
Yep.
And and the thing I remind, especially the younger trainers that I teach is it's okay. It's good to have an ideal. It's good to have an ideal on paper, but that ideal may not in any way, shape, or form, resonate with the person in front of you.
Exactly. Exactly. It's
And
always it's always yeah, go on.
and also something else just to think about is in general, that client in front of you doesn't care.
Right.
It's
Right.
not as important to them as it is to you. Now, to get them in a proper neutral spine where they're pain-free range of motion, where they can be comfortable, where they can exercise, super important to them because once you teach them that, they're like, "Oh, I'm safe here. Great, I can stay here." That's important to work on it. We'll talk about that in a second. But trying to get them into that, traditional, optimal neutral spine, we don't need to, you know?
Right. The key thing there is exactly what you said is you're trying to find, and this is, we're talking about an acute disc injury here when we start this conversation. All right. We're starting with
Yep.
somebody who has low back issues, who has back pain, who probably has some nerve symptoms down into their hip or their thigh or their foot, right? There's some clear pain going on that wants to be managed. And our first step with a disc issue is always, for me, let's see what we can do to find a better position to potentially decrease the discomfort that you're currently in. Like, that's step one, is pain relief, pain control. And a
Yep.
lot of times that means limiting your range of motion, particularly in flexion, possibly limiting your motion in a lot of different areas. So with a lot of my disc clients, I teach them to do everything flat backed. Like, can you put your shoes on relatively flat backed? Can you roll out of bed relatively flat backed, or at least without flexing? If you get in and out of your car, maintaining that stability and that support of the musculature around that low back so that they're not getting that pressure into the discs in their daily activities.
Yep. And that's super important. And a lot of it comes down to making sure that they have the mobility in their hips with that
Yeah.
stability in their low back,
Yep.
because we're really trying to teach them here. And it may be a 1 or 2 degree. You and I have both seen those clients that come in and you find that area like, oh, wow, I don't have any pain. But as soon as they move a little bit,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, there it is. So now we
Mhm.
can say, okay, here's where your range of motion is. But now you have to be able to do things like, yeah, get up and down off the toilet and put on your
Mhm.
shoes and get in and out of the car, huge
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so how can we do that? We need to make sure that they can move through the other joints as well, like moving through their hips and whatnot, so they can keep that lumbar spine neutral and stable while they're still able to do their activities of daily life, at least at the beginning.
Yes. One other thing, so this gives us to that point of, a lot of times when I've got clients with a low back disc problem, I'm not doing spinal mobility particularly with them, right?
Yeah.
I'm mostly working on stability for days, marching, very simple, all fours, pulling the abdominals in, seated, finding that neutral, standing, finding that neutral. That's a lot of where I'm working.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean I'm not doing other things. So, along with that, for example, I can work on a neutral squat,
Mhm.
right? And it can be a very low, it doesn't have to be a deep squat. It can be a very short squat, if you will, but just how you're going to get up and down, maintaining that position of the back while strengthening and working on the mobility and the stability of the hips.
Yep.
Right. And I also, if it's appropriate, and the Pilates environment is wonderful for this because I can do a lot of upper body work without stressing the back. That's harder to do
Mhm.
seated. It's harder to do standing, but I can do some of that supine and, do all your arm work supine with the low back. Maybe I've got a wedge under there or something to maintain the stability of the low back and get some upper body strength as well. Because if the upper body is weak, that stress will go into the low back. If the lower body is weak or tight, that stress will go into the back.
Mhm.
And so working on those other parts of the body that I can address will often then have a beneficial impact on that low back.
And teaching them those spinal stability exercises, there are a lot of them that they can do at home, even
Yeah.
something as simple as marching, because how many of us have the client who can move one leg perfectly well and the other side, as soon as they go to move it, their spine wants to shift out, it wants to flatten, it
Mhm.
wants to arch. And just teaching how to do simple marching can be a lifesaver for them. And I love teaching things even on the reformer, where you can get them to squat and work on that hip flexion, almost like they're pulling their knees in, but guess what? The springs are actually pulling them in. So they can be reminded, oh, here's what I need to do. Here's how I need to move my hips. Here's how to move them properly. And
Yep.
it's a great way to introduce that. So they say, oh, okay, I can feel this. So that when I eventually want to take them into more of a standing position or even a seated position where they're sitting and now they have to move a leg, they're like, oh, how do I lift that? They already know. Their body remembers.
Exactly. One thing I want to say too about marching or any of those exercises is, if you can help them feel the stability or instability, you're going to be more successful, right?
Yes.
It's because a client could do marching and have no idea that their pelvis is doing what I always call the samba, right? Like, and you ask them if they feel like their hips are moving, and they're like, no. right? I mean, that's very, very typical with that. So putting your hands under the low back to make sure it's staying stable, or even under
Mhm.
kind of the sides of the hip, not
Yep.
underneath the butt itself, but kind of under the side of the hip. They can often feel, oh yeah, no, it's moving. I'm getting more pressure on my hand when I lift my right leg and less on my left leg. They can really keep that pressure even, or put a towel roll or something under the low back. So they've got that feeling, that
Yep.
proprioceptive feedback, tactile feedback, which can really help them to know, where am I?
Yep.
When things I say about the low back is, it's an awareness exercise for
Yep.
you and for them.
100%.
But if they can be more aware of what works, what feels better, and what doesn't, then they can make the choices to do what feels better.
Yep. One of the things I like to do in that position for the marching and things of that nature is I'll actually tell them to not push down on their opposite leg, because that will always want them to twist their hips.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's something that's very typical. Instead of using our core to actually lift the leg, we have a tendency to push down on the opposite leg to draw that other knee in and use just the hip flexor. So I'll start them by putting my hands under their feet, and I'll say, now lift one leg. And I say, don't push down, don't push down. So I can feel it. And they can also feel that they're pushing into my squishy hand. They're like, oh,
Nice.
and I joke with them, you break my fingers, I charge you extra. It lightens the mood, but then they're like, okay, they get it. They can feel that. And then I'm
Nice.
like, anchor that feeling.
Yes, exactly.
For me, a lot of it is getting them to be able to feel their own body, because
Yes.
if their hands are under their back or on their hips or wherever, they're still using their common senses. They're using their tactile senses, which is
Hmm.
important at first. But I want them to really get into, okay, feel what should be working. Can you feel
Yep.
as soon as they lighten up on that foot? It's like, oh, I can feel my core. My abs are really engaging. Good.
Awesome.
Keep that feeling, and then work from there. Because now I could say, okay, can we do this? Can we do that? Can you lift one leg up, then the other leg up? And they can feel that stability and not moving. And it's an easy way for them to get into that and go, oh, I feel it now.
I love that, because one of the things that I've always said about really physical training anyway, but particularly about Pilates, because that's been my primary discipline, is it is an awareness practice.
Yeah.
And with low back, man, if I can get somebody to be in their body, to feel what their body's doing, that's where the change happens. And the wonderful thing about both the personal training environment that Brian's in and the Pilates environment that I'm in is we have a lot of tools. I call it, this is going to sound a funny analogy, but Hansel and Gretel, right? Hansel and Gretel, like
Mhm.
they go off to the Wicked Witch's house, and they leave little crumbs to whatever, the little crumb
Yep.
situation. If the client doesn't have the experience, if they've never felt what you want them to feel, they can't find it.
Yep.
Maybe, right? Like if they don't know what you're talking about, because a lot of times we're like, yeah, are you feeling this? They're like, sure, I don't know what you're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
Clients want to
Yep.
make us happy. But if they can actually feel it, and they get that feeling, oh, that's what it is. And then what I say is, if I can give them that sensation, help them find that through tactile feedback, through using certain tools, certain resistance in certain directions, whatever, all the tools that I've got, if I could give them the sensation and have them actually really feel it,
Mhm.
then it's almost like, okay, now I want you to build the path to that feeling for
Yes.
yourself. Right,
Yes.
if that makes sense. And that's where the crumbs come in, the crumb analogy. I know you don't end up with the Wicked Witch's house and getting eaten, but basically the crumb analogy gets you to that sensation. Because once they've
Yep.
had the feeling, then they can find their way back to it.
Bingo. Exactly. And that's really the important thing. How many times have we met the beginner trainer who has one cue for an exercise?
Yes, yes,
And
exactly.
that's all they have is one
They got
cue.
one. Hmm.
And while that's fine for 50% of their people or 30% or however many, and people are going to say, okay, yeah, I guess I'm doing it. You need to have 50, 60 different ways to say the same thing. And for this, it's the same thing. We need to lead them to where we need them to be so that
Mm.
they are feeling their body. So I'll use my hands, I'll use
Yep,
sticks, I'll
yep.
use whatever it takes,
Bands, balls, reformers,
whatever,
chairs, anything you can. Unstable
anything.
surfaces. Yeah.
And also, sometimes it's just changing the exercise. I remember one guy who came in, he could not for the life of him figure out while being supine what I was trying to get him to do. Could
Mm.
not. But when I took him to seated or standing, I could get him to feel it. I was like, okay, you know what? Fine. That's not the position for you. But instead of beating my head against the wall, which I did for a couple of weeks, thinking, come on, I've got to find a way. Finally, I was like, get up, just get up. Let's go over here. Because I just needed to change everything. And once we did that, he said, oh, I can feel this. Where? That's where I need you to feel. All right, good. Let's anchor this feeling. And then we came back to that later, and he was able to anchor it.
And that's a great story for several reasons, right? Because if you're not getting the results you want, right, your client isn't responding the way you want them to, they're not feeling what you want them to feel, it's really easy, and especially for a beginning teacher, but for all of us to just go, I'm just going to keep trying, right?
Yep.
A friend of mine tells a funny story of he and his buddy were down in Costa Rica. His buddy's kind of a big, loud American. I'll just be blunt on that. And he's in line at a buffet and he's like, is this fish? Right? He's asking in English, is this fish? And the guy's going, no, it's potatoes, which is papas. He says fish. The guy goes, papas, fish, papas, fish, papas. Like he just keeps getting louder, thinking that something is going to change. And it's like, it's still potatoes. And sometimes you'll see that with a trainer, right? They'll go, well, just keep, they'll kind of double down. And the client is just getting more and more frustrated. And I've certainly
Yes.
seen this a few times. And it's like, just drop it. Like nothing's going to happen there. The walls are up. They're, just drop it and go on to something else maybe the same thing, but in a different environment, a different way, right?
Yep.
Get them around that defensiveness that's built up or that lack of success or that frustration that's built up.
Yes, absolutely. You need to have a variety of ways to cue your clients. You need to have a variety of exercises because one may
Yeah.
not work and another one might. And when it comes to working on stability of the spine, there are lots and lots to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
You got to find what's going to work for the client in front of you and not necessarily what you're most comfortable with. It's about the client and what gets them to the end goal first.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that comes with experience.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, one of the things that I actually had one of my trainers do that I thought was excellent. She was interested in imagery anyway and different ways to say things. Well, she actually went through her manual and she wrote down several different images and cues for
Mm,
each exercise, which I thought was really interesting. And because she was very attached to that particular way of teaching, but she was also like using her imagination because
mhm.
sometimes you've got to be very direct. Like I think with a lot of my athletic clients and some of my male clients, it's like, put your leg there,
Yep.
right? Feel your thigh squeeze, right? I've got to be very blunt. Other clients, I can be very much like, imagine that the energy is moving from your femur through your patella or whatever it is. And
Yep.
and that'll work for other people. And I've got to have every range in between there.
I'm thinking of I had a physical therapist. She and I were working together, and she always told me to make my abs smile. I had no idea what the hell she was telling me to do. It didn't make sense to me. And I'm good. I'm usually very vivid imagery. I work well with that. I'm creative in that
It's
sense,
just
but I'm
like,
like,
what?
make my
Like, is
abs
that
smile.
smiling? Is that smiling?
I had no idea what she was talking about.
That's
And
funny.
finally, one day it dawned on me. And an analogy I used was elevator doors. I said, from your two hip bones to your midline, close your elevator doors. Basically suck it
Yeah.
in and pull it
Yeah, yeah,
in.
yeah. Pull it in. Yeah, yeah.
And when I did that, she goes, "Oh, you're making your abs smile." And immediately I went, "Okay, that's what you call this. Got it."
Right.
But
Right.
over and over, she said the same thing over and over. And I'm thinking, that's not working for me. That's not working for me. So again, finding whatever works for you is great. You got to make sure it's working for the client in front of you.
Right. And that example you were talking about was great because what we're talking about there is that engagement, right? That inner unit
Mhm.
engagement. So closing your elevator doors, pulling your belly button towards your spine, making your waist smaller.
Whatever
Lots of
works.
ways to talk about that, right? Whatever works to just kind of pull that in. And oftentimes with a disc injury, my very first homework is pull the abdominals in every time you put any load through the back. So if
Yes.
when you walk out that door, pull those in, then open the door. When you go to your car, pull those in, then open the car door, and then pull them in before you try to get into your car and wiggle around the way you have to wiggle around in your car. Before you lift something heavy off the stove, before you pick up your child, before you throw that baseball, whatever it is that they're doing, it's like just start with just that awareness. Like, oh, I can sort of pull that in.
Yes.
That stabilizes that low back, at least temporarily, right? For that extra load that's about to come through it. So it's like, that's always like, homework number one.
Well, I can't tell you how many times a client will say, well, that exercise hurt my back. And all I have to do is just say, engage your abs.
Yes, exactly.
And
In
they do
any
that like, oh, it doesn't hurt anymore. I'm like, exactly. But what you
uh-huh.
said is perfect when they are at the very beginning stages. A lot of times people come to me after physical therapy and they've learned how to brace and they know how to tighten everything before they move. And I'm
Hold it
like, great.
together.
Right. And at that point, that's what they needed.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, we need a little less of that because, I'm not trying to create hemorrhoids here. We don't need to increase intra-abdominal pressure that much, but we want to get the engagement. And that's when we can
Yeah.
go back a couple episodes ago. We talked about the inner unit, trying to get the transverse abdominis firing. And just, a great way that I find when they're in a supine position and they're like, I don't understand what you mean. I can't do it. I'll tell them, take your hands, put them together like you're praying and push them to the sky. So their arms are directly in front of them. And I'll say,
Mhm.
okay, now I'm going to ask you to engage your core. And I gently push on their hands in one direction. So I'm
Mm.
basically providing that rotational. Now I start very slowly and suddenly I can
Yeah.
see when their eyes get big, they're like, oh, did you feel your abs engage? Great. And I'll pull the other direction. Do you feel your abs engage? Yes. Okay. Now I want you to engage your abs as you try and get up off the table or as you try and push this. I'm going to put a band in your hand and I want you to push. Now engage your abs, same way. By getting them to feel it, they're like, oh, yeah. Okay. They can recreate that without that bearing down, which is what they were taught. And that's fine at the beginning. But now we need more of an engagement rather than a feeling.
And it needs to start to be more dynamic, right? We talked about
Yes.
stability there. Um, the reformer, the Pilates environment, similar. And I can add somebody just is sitting. Let's say they're sitting, however they're sitting on the reformer and doing arm work, right?
Mhm.
Pressing both straps forward. That's a really great place to say, okay, engage your abs, then push. Engage your abs, then pull. Engage your abs in long stretch, right? In a plank position. All those ways to get that going. But the other thing too about going beyond the bracing piece and even beyond the don't move your back out of this position piece, because that's an early phase rehabilitation, is
Mhm.
at some point you're trying to get them back to more normal movement patterns, right? Not completely restricted and kind of corseted movement patterns. Those are really great for pain control often at the beginning, but some clients can get attached to those
Oh,
way
yeah.
beyond when it's useful and actually cause other troubles. To take us like back to the beginning for a moment, if you're really not moving your spine at all, you're decreasing that nourishment to the rest of the discs.
Right.
And and when somebody's afraid of spinal movement because they've had back pain, they'll often just sort of solidify the whole thing, which isn't ultimately healthy for anything. So I always find that in some ways that breaking those barriers, breaking them into more full body movement is a really interesting and tricky place for
Mhm.
clients. Starting to go into flexion, starting to go into extension, starting to add rotation. Those are the moments where I find I've really got to be very, very gentle, very careful. I'll introduce one thing on a very
Mhm.
simple level, small range of motion, and then I'll see how they respond that day, the next day, the next day, before I move on.
And that's a great way to think about it. To take them from the bracing, it's super conscious. They
Yeah.
have that conscious, I have to hold this as I open the refrigerator door. I have to hold this, whatever it is. And then when it's an engagement, I find there's a little less consciousness. They still have to be conscious a little
Mhm.
bit and you remind them, but eventually you want all of that to come naturally and be unconscious. So they have more unconscious movement so that they
Yes.
can just pick something up or do something that you're asking them to do either here or they're picking up their child, they're putting on their backpack, carrying their briefcase, whatever it is that they're not thinking about every single movement.
Right.
Now, when it comes to moving them toward better movement and more dynamic movement, which is our goal, obviously, what I try and do is introduce things in a step-by-step way,
Mhm.
again, working with the hips to teach a little bit of hip mobility through marching or dropping the knee out to the side while maintaining a safe neutral spine, etc. Just to introduce that rotation to come from the shoulders and the thoracic spine, so that they're not trying to, really wrench on those discs in the lumbar spine, which really weren't designed to rotate much anyway. But by breaking it down a little bit, I can take them from a controlled environment where I can control their movement and limit their movement to a certain degree because I want to keep them safe, especially when you're introducing rotation. You really have to be careful because that sometimes can
Mhm.
bother things. So limit that. You want a few degrees at a time and find out, like for me, I've got a disc issue. One way I rotate perfectly. The other side, if things are angry that day, it's like, oh, I can't go that far today. And that's okay. Respect it. But by starting at a limitation and beginning to build into that, then getting them into eventually more of a dynamic movement where I have them doing a pushing or pulling with rotation, with their legs stable in a standing position, which is much more functional in life. They can get into that and think, oh, yeah, I can do this.
Yeah.
And after that, I can get them into things thinking about playing sports or activities or, because if a guy wants to go back to golf, I'm not going to get him into golf until I've taught all those steps leading up to that.
Right.
You have to take it sometimes by chunks and reintroduce things. And I find that works.
Aggressively.
Yeah, that works
Yeah.
great for some of my clients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so, with disc things, you have to look at that. You have to look at where they're trying to get to, right? So we've talked about sort of the beginning stages, and then we talked a little through how do you progress them forward, but where are they trying to get to?
Mhm.
For a lot of my clients, when I was working at St. Francis, especially, they were kind of just trying to feel better because they,
Yep.
they were in a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, and they weren't really looking at doing anything beyond ordinary daily activities. But even that, then teaching them how to put their shoes on, teaching them how to put their pants on. If you've ever tried to keep your hips flexed and your back neutral, you put your pants on, it's a little bit of a challenge.
A little bit.
Right? I mean, even getting out of bed without any rotation is a little bit tricky. Like, okay, whoa, hey, log roll over and then kind of push yourself up. So just working on where they're trying to get to. Again, are they trying to get back to golf? Are they trying to get back to dance? Are they trying to get back to cycling, which is a pretty flexion oriented activity? And then how do you gently build them back up into that?
Yep, exactly, exactly. We should probably talk a little bit about different types of exercises and what is considered safe for these clients.
Mhm.
My brain immediately goes, as most people do, to the McKenzie exercises that we've
Uh-huh.
talked about before, which provide more of an extension. In general, if all they have is a disc issue, now there are a lot
Yeah.
of clients
If.
out there who have who have
Yeah. Multitude of
other
things.
things. Yes, if and these are my younger clients, I find my under 40 will often, if they have a disc issue, oftentimes it'll just be the disc issue. If they're in their mid 50s, early 60s, or something like that, I'm usually going to assume that they have other contributing factors as well, not just the disc. So, why don't we talk about pelvic bias a little bit and the
Mhm.
position we want them to be in? Because we talked about that a little bit. We do want them to be in more of an extension bias where their back is going to have a little bit more of an arch, which is
Right,
where the
neutral
McKenzie
towards
exercises.
extension. Right,
Right,
exactly, as
exactly.
opposed to flexion. Yep.
Exactly. So those McKenzie exercises, and you can find them online. You can Google those. Those are real easy. And I'll show some of those in our video version through showing some exercises. But I thought, let's talk a little bit about what we want to accomplish when we're working with these clients and the position that we sort of want them to be in during exercise.
So, remember we talked about the disc and how that jelly donut, right, flexion is gonna push that disc material back towards the spinal cord, and extension is going to, do the opposite. It's gonna push that disc material away from the spinal cord. And this is where, like, a McKenzie exercise, the classical McKenzie exercise is kinda like a mini swan.
Hmm.
Fairly relaxed, and your hands under your shoulders. You're just very gently pushing up into a gentle, not very, in fact, you're really trying to let the back go into extension as opposed to really supporting it from the front. And you're trying to use that to gently push that disc material away from the nerves, which are typically right
Yep.
in the back of the spine. And so when you're working with somebody, you're often looking at how do I maximize neutral towards extension and minimize flexion.
Yep.
right?
Yep.
In whatever exercise choice I'm making, and also in terms of my strategies for having them either return to sport or return to their daily activities. How am I going to limit the amount of time they're spending in flexion?
Yeah. And I think that's a great way to put it, is to limit, because
Mhm.
you and I are in a little bit of flexion just sitting here.
Yeah.
We're in flexion a lot. I mean, try and use the bathroom on a low toilet without flexing your spine. You're not going to be very successful at it. It's just not going to happen. Or getting into a low automobile. Uh, it's just not going to happen very easily. For me, a lot of times it's okay. You're going to do that position for a little bit. Then I want you to come out of it and go into a rest position. Oftentimes I'll call it. So I love that mini swan idea. I call it the Sphinx, where they're on their elbows, and
Yeah.
can drop into their hips stay on the ground, lifting their
Yep.
chest, but staying on their elbows. And I'll do that between exercises as a
Yep.
rest. They don't even know why they're doing it. And it's okay. I'll explain the reasoning, but it's not as important to them as it is for me to give them that and have them hold it for 30 seconds just to take that pressure off. And one of the
To give Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just to give it a reset, right? Because again, if you've
Exactly.
done something or they've been sitting or they've been doing something, it just can reset that.
Yep. I love teaching also for people when they're out grocery shopping or out doing something where they're in a standing position, is just put their hands on the back of their hips or their low back, gently push forward as they lean their chest back and they arch their back.
Yeah, just a tiny little like,
Yeah.
one of those moments, right? Like, oh, yeah,
And hold
sitting,
that.
standing. Yep.
Yeah, especially because, and I use the grocery store analogy just because I watch them and and you think, well, I'm just standing here. You're not. You're bending over, you're reaching, you're grabbing the tomato, you're looking at this one, then you're reaching over here and you've got a lot of rotation. You're moving around more than you think in a flexed position when you're picking things up
Mhm.
or you're reaching on that bottom shelf. And so when you're in line, just stand there and do that little arch. Hold that 10 seconds, 15 seconds. It can just take the pressure off. And a lot of the clients that I've had who have had disc issues say that is a godsend. They love the feeling because it does. It helps them just to relieve it for that brief period of time and hit that reset button. That's a great way to put it. Hit that reset button.
That's great, Brian, because I do that a lot with clients, and I've in a lot of different ways because it resets it. And one thing that I want to say along with that is many clients who have low back pain think that a forward fold or basically like a hamstring stretch, leaning over where they're putting their back into flexion, gives them temporary relief from their back pain. Right. So,
Yep.
I mean, especially I think about my dancers who are like, stretching is everything. I just need to stretch more. And it's like, okay, stop doing that. Right. Just you have to stop doing that for now and instead go into this extension move because I have to say, extension is not intuitively obvious if you have back pain.
No, it's not.
It's not at all. It's like that's not really what you want to do. You most want to kind of curl up in a ball and wait for it to go away into flexion. You don't really want to, oh, my back pain. I've got back pain. That's not really the inclination. So teaching them about that importance of extension is just a critical piece. And
I think
again, not intuitive.
it's not. And I think that's the key. Their intuition is to stretch it because they feel the muscles. They don't feel the bones. They don't feel the
Right.
discs. They
Yep.
feel the muscle and the muscle stretches. Well, those muscles can often be in spasm. And so when you stretch them, you get a very brief amount of temporary relief.
Exactly.
But as soon as they sit up from there, they're taking
Hmm.
themselves into extension. That's when the muscle's like, oh, I'm going to grab now. When we're doing some of these other, reset exercises, these McKenzie exercises, it's about relaxation. It's
Yeah.
not about getting those muscles to fire yet. I'm not
No,
doing a
it's about
back
letting
extension
that
exercise.
curve happen in the low back, right? Really let it just kind of sink, let your belly
Exactly.
sink into the ground.
Yeah, let
Yeah.
gravity help you and
Yeah.
allow those muscles to relax into extension, and that will allow that disc to just help it reset forward so that that jelly will slide back in. Rather than trying to get on a back extension machine where you're just aggravating the muscles, it's more about a relaxation.
Right. Right. Good point. What one last little thing about that is being cautious with just how let's see how clients really take some of this stuff in.
Mm,
What I wanted to say was, oftentimes with disc injuries, you have a version of sciatica. You have some irritation of the nerves, right? And that's a lot of what we're trying to get rid of. So I just wanted to point that out. With more than one client, the first time let's say they're having some sciatic symptoms at the moment, or they're having some burning into their thigh, or their butt feels a little bit like it's got some nerve symptoms, or if it's tingling down into the foot, and they take that McKenzie work, and more than once, it's like, oh, the pain went from my foot and is now kind of moving up towards my spine, right? Like it moves, it's called centralization,
mhm.
right? And that's when I really know like that is the right exercise for that person. If they get a decrease in nerve symptoms that immediately, which occasionally happens, then I know I'm absolutely on the right track.
Yep, absolutely. Now I'm going to put one caveat in here.
Yes.
Okay. Because you and I have said this many times on this podcast, and we're probably going to say it many, many, many other times. Just because their MRI says that they have a disc
Mhm.
herniation doesn't necessarily mean that's what's causing their low back pain today. So if
Yes.
they do
Right.
have a multitude of spinal, I'm just going to say contributing factors, whether it be
Yep.
stenosis, spondylolisthesis, spondylosis, whatever it is, if they have other contributing factors, you don't know for sure which one is causing it today.
Yep.
How so extension may not be the best thing for them. If you find that doing some of these exercises seems to make things worse, well, guess what? Back off. Try the other way. And that's usually when that first session I have with them, I'll put them lying supine, or even before that, I'll ask what feels better, sitting or standing. If they say standing, usually extension is going to feel better for them. If they say
Mhm.
sitting, I sit and all the pain goes away. Flexion bias is going to be
Yep.
more
Yep.
comfortable for them.
Yep.
So listen and watch what they do and see what feels makes it feel better and what makes it feel worse. Sometimes just asking them, what makes it feel better? Oh, standing. Standing and walking makes it feel great. They need more extension. Oh,
Yep.
sitting down. As soon as I sit, all the pressure, I don't have that numbness down my leg anymore. Okay. Flexion seems to work
And
better for
flexion's
that
the deal.
person.
Yeah,
So
that's
listen
really,
to
really good,
them.
simple, yeah, a simple assessment tool.
Yeah. So just not everybody with a disc injury needs extension. Okay.
Mhm.
Listen to their body. If it seems to make it worse, try the other way. Try more flexion based and just see if you can find that pain-free range of motion in their spinal, orientation or their bias that they need. So just something to take away for.
Yep, and I know for me, I always feel like it takes me a couple of weeks if I'm seeing somebody twice a week to really get a clear view of what works and what doesn't. Because
Yeah.
again, something could feel better while they're with me, but they could get more pain later that day or the next day or the next day. And I always ask when they come back, like, how did you do when you got home? How did you do the next morning? How'd you do the next day?
Yep.
If things are getting better, then I know I'm in the right track. If they said, "Oh yeah, I know, when I got home, I was really in a lot of pain that night, the next morning," okay, I'm probably not on the right track. And this is why they call it practice because especially the low back, it's you just gotta you kind of hunt and peck, and then that's sometimes change. Sometimes a client can resolve one part of their back issue, and then another one suddenly becomes like the major troublemaker. And so you just got to stay aware, keep them aware, and you stay aware of what's happening there.
And also, they're not trying to fool you. They're not. They
Right? No.
they are trying to help you. However, I had one client coming into me, disc herniation. Is that all you have? Yep, disc herniation. Okay. Did you get an MRI? I like to see it just so I know there's nothing else, lingering. And they said, oh yeah, and I'll bring it in. Didn't bring it in. We're doing the exercises with extension. Nothing's working. Feels good, like you said, while they're doing it. Because again,
Mhm.
exercise and movement can make people feel good, but it's making it
Yeah.
worse. She has more
Yeah.
pain, more pain. And finally, she brings in 3 weeks later her MRI. And in clear as day, it says stenosis and spondylolisthesis as well.
Uh-huh. Right. Right.
So immediately I realized I was doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Took her into a different, position, more flexion based. Suddenly, within 2 or 3 sessions, oh my gosh, my pain is almost gone. It's like magic. It's like, well, we now have you in the proper position. So that she wasn't trying to be, trying to hide anything from me. It's just she didn't have the clearest picture. And sometimes it's nice to have that clear picture. So if something's not working, try something else. See if that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's just there's the pathology which they may or may not know and understand and give you the accurate information about, and then there's their experience. And
Yep.
those are, again, as we've said many times, not always related. So then it's like, okay, try this, that doesn't work, try this. Okay, that works. Then I'm going to work on you in flexion. Even
Yep.
if you say you're coming in for a disc herniation, like maybe that's part of it, but that's not what's causing your pain. Or it's
Yep.
certainly, the usual things I do for that are not bringing you relief. So
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Well, I think we did a nice deep dive today into disc issues. And again, if you want
yeah.
more, we covered this for 90 minutes and we showed a ton of exercises on Level Up Movement. We
Hmm.
covered a ton of exercises on there. So if you want to see more, go to levelupmovement.com, put in low back, and it'll take you to the class that we just did. We also have that Q&A coming up. What's the date for that?
14th.
14th, I think it is. Let me take a
Yes.
quick gander as we look like, what is the date? Yep, the 14th of April. We're going to be doing that. So if you guys want to join us live, you can. It's sort of our version of Ask Me Anything, and it's a video version. So you can ask any questions about the discs that you want, and we'll be live on Level Up Movement and be able to answer any of those questions. And you can always get in touch with us again at movingconvos@gmail.com or through our socials at Moving Convos, all of our on Instagram or Facebook, Moving Conversations. Also, Nora and my socials are all on the course or on the description of on the website, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whichever is your flavor of the month. So you can always catch us there. And if you're enjoying what you're hearing, please do us a favor, like, subscribe, hit all of those things. Comment, say what you like. Tell us what you'd like us to cover. The more you comment, the better it is for our algorithms as well, so that we can sort of rise up through the ranks. And we really do appreciate it. We appreciate everyone who listens. So thank you very much. And anything you want to cover before we take off?
No, just check it out. This is like number 42 in terms of episodes. So,
Uh-huh.
if there's anything you're interested in that we haven't talked about, go back through the repertoire and you may find something interesting. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.